I think the most honest opinion would be the Sheikh Jarrah would be the start. It may not necessarily have been the reason predominantly for the conflict, but it was the start of the current outbreak of hostilities.
Sheikh Jarrah was the chronological start of the current outbreak of hostilities, but the outbreak is about a lot more than just Sheikh Jarrah.
Agreed.
Seems to be the least of it. It seems more like a court case that they're watching because it could decide a lot, on the order of the sort of court cases that people in law school learn about as, say, the pivotal Supreme Court cases that set the tone of the country for a while back. At most, Sheikh Jarrah is on the order of something like the nation state law. It's probably on a lot less of an order than the nation state law. Yes, the nation state law has been cited as a ruling for subsequent court cases. The nation state law, for those who might not know, is a law that was passed a few years ago that basically stipulated a whole bunch of things. It's as close as Israel gets to having part of its constitution written, because Israel does not have a constitution, but it stipulates things like Israel is the home of the Jewish people. Hebrew is the official language. Arabic was downgraded as a language, and a number of other items in that vein. That is the nation state law. And so the nation state law was codifying a lot of things that Israel was doing implicitly, although it did break some ground that was different from a relatively large sector of Israeli public opinion, like about the status of Jerusalem. And nation state law was cited later as a legal ruling. The nation state law, despite being objected to by a large number of the local Arabs, did not spark the same level of violence that Sheikh Jarrah supposedly did. And Sheikh Jarrah was supposedly the outbreak, whereas the nation state law was passed during a relatively quiet period in Israeli-Palestinian violence. So the question then for you becomes, why this? I believe it was obviously a lot more than Sheikh Jarrah itself.
I agree that, and I think it was a lot more. And if you were being very cynical, you might suggest that both Hamas and the Likud party benefited politically from the current outbreak, and they were both very keen to see the current outbreak. And again, there's no evidence of this, but the outcome is certainly that Netanyahu managed to swing Bennett over to his camp and away from the Arab list. Hamas has managed to gain support across all factions of Palestinians, from Israeli Palestinians to the West Bank, as well as the Gazans. And in fact, I think that's the first time I've seen that sort of solidarity in Palestinians, which must come as a blow to the Israeli leaders that were working at dividing the Palestinian communities. So I think those two benefited. I think there's also, there's been a perpetual bubble forming on the rights of Palestinians and the annexation of the West Bank. There's been a lot of stories over the last, maybe say the last 12 months on outposts and settlement violence. There's been stories on annexation, was headline news for a while as Trump was leaving. The encroachment of more Jews and the announcement of more settlements in East Jerusalem. So these were all building up in a pressure cooker. And Sheikh Jarrah was just more affirmation of the same Palestinian mindset that they're slowly dispossessing us of land and backing us into a corner. We're going to have nowhere to go. I see that as the predominant driver in the Palestinian sentiment that would have created Sheikh Jarrah.
Well, I'm definitely with you about the whole thing with Netanyahu versus Hamas, and that it is fairly cynical, but Netanyahu really does have potentially a lot to lose if he were to leave office now. So he is likely to be doing all kinds of things to be preventing his opponents from forming a coalition. So he saw Bennett and some other people forming a coalition against him with Ra'am. So he killed the possibility of a Jewish-Arab coalition in one fell swoop. This really concerns me. It was, in a sense, it was kind of the same before this episode and after this episode. This episode was not even the bloodiest episode, not even close. It always takes a new mutation and a new permutation. And this episode, as things went, it was relatively short, and I'm very sorry for the people who were scared. I'm very sorry for the people who were hurt. I'm very sorry for the people who died, but it was not nearly as bad as some of the ones that, it wasn't nearly as bad as, say, 2014 even, let alone the intifadas. And so it's still the same people, and it's still the same status quo. And the status quo, it concerns me a lot, and it's really hurting a lot of people.
It certainly changed the direction of where this conflict was going. If not changed it, then certainly pushed it back a few steps. I got the sense over the last 2 years that that we were moving closer towards a peace agreement. Trump plays into that, and no, I didn't think that when Trump was coming towards the end of his term and he was giving Israel plenty of concessions, but certainly in terms of the fact that Netanyahu had to pander to the Arab electorate in Israel, probably for the first time. The fact was an indication of a change of sentiment within Israel. The fact that there had to be 4 elections and a 5th coming up potentially was also an indication of a change of direction, because I don't think Netanyahu became more liberal in his views. He became more hardened and hard-lined and conservative. And I think I find it hopeful that the Israeli public pushed back against that. I think that's a good thing. It certainly suggests that there is still a large element of centrists in Israel, as opposed to the idea that Israel as a society has moved to the far right.
I'm hoping, I can see that. I was actually not sure in the past few years. Some people said it was not getting closer. I did notice that things were a lot quieter during the quiet period, but there was still the same. One difference was that the Palestinian side was focused on being nonviolent, and part of their talking points here in the West was that these initiatives, these efforts that are on the Palestinian side, like BDS, are nonviolent. That was one of the arguments that they were making for it.
Yes.
And so now the tune's changed a little bit. Now the tune is more about things like the right to resist, that the occupier has grown so bad that the Palestinians, they have a right to resist against it because they have really crossed lines. Now, Israel.
What's your thought that that Biden was not the Messiah the Palestinians had hoped for? He certainly seemed to be more washing his hands of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than he was trying to undo the things that Trump did.
Well, in terms of Israel-Palestine, my thoughts as well is, was Hamas testing Biden? Hamas was doing a flare-up of violence in Gaza, and part of it does seem to have been about the PA. The PA canceled elections when Fatah presumably would have lost. Abbas is not very popular. And part of it is that he's seen as being a collaborator with Israel and someone who did not deliver results. Also, quite importantly, so there are a bunch of Palestinians in the West Bank who were very hopeful that Fatah's more moderate and nonviolent approach would have paid off, and they are very disenchanted. Now, was there, what were the ramifications? The settlements are still expanding in the West Bank. Yes, there's a lot less Israeli on Arab violence in the sense of bombings and direct attacks than there might be, like Gaza is being bombed, was being bombed. And obviously I'd have to see the numbers. But Palestinians were certainly not getting the statehood that they had hoped for under Fatah. They were still seeing Israel expanding, pushing into the West Bank, and not letting up the pressure. Now,
do you think that there's been a fundamental shift in the cultural mindset of Palestinians, in that they now think, given say 2 decades of peaceful resistance and cooperation, certainly on security side with Israel, the PA has achieved nothing and lost a lot in East Jerusalem annexation, the Golan Heights annexation, the growth of settlers from say 30,000 when Netanyahu first came into office to approaching 1 million now, the loss of water resources. Whereas they look at Gaza, who have adopted a violent resistance stance, and they see that Gaza managed to get Israel to draw up borders, pull settlements out of Gaza. Admittedly, it's come at a cost. The siege has been grueling, but there's been much more achieved with violent resistance than passive resistance.
Well, obviously, Palestinians on average, they are better off than Palestinians in Gaza. And Gaza, for example, it has a blockade. So Gazans, despite the expansion of the settlements, are probably suffering more on a day-to-day level. They have limited water, limited electricity, lower standard of living than they do in the West Bank. And so there is that. Gaza, and the kind of shape that it's in, is one of the major talking points about the problems Israel is causing. And so it is not like Gazans are better off for having been violent, at least according to the talking points. If they're going to talk about how Gaza is now free of Israel, Israel's boot has let up, except its boot has not let up. It controls most of the imports and the exports Israel is effectively controlling Gaza despite not having a presence to speak of on the ground. It's controlling it in other ways that may be more stringent. It is a tiny area that is about half of the size of New York City. A lot of people don't even realize how tiny Gaza is, and people can't really get in and out of this area. And so this is an issue.
So do you think that the term open air prison describes Gaza at the moment? That it's used a lot.
It's used a lot. It's used a lot. It describes it about as much as, say, a medieval castle under siege. Obviously a much larger version of it, but a medieval castle was a walled town as well, just like Gaza is, except the walls in Gaza's case are put in basically by Israel instead of by them. So that is
so Troy.
Troy or any medieval castle or walled town that would be under siege. Obviously, Gaza is larger in land area than those would be. Its population is about the size of the state of Nebraska, but that is the analogy I would draw to what Gaza is. One of the things about a prison is that a prison is the kind of place that no one wants to be in. And so in a prison, as soon as you're released, the first thing that you would want to do is escape. Whereas in the case of Gaza, people do not want to leave Gaza. They want to stay in Gaza. They just want it opened up. So in that sense, Gaza is not a prison. Gaza is the place people want to be in. It's just not how they want to be in it.
I get occasional messages through Messenger from people in Gaza, strangers, not people I know. And I engage them in conversations because it's an interesting perspective to talk to somebody who's living there on an everyday basis. Certainly two that I'm thinking about, both young men, one was 17 and one was 24, both harbored dreams of leaving Gaza, going to Europe and establishing new lives in Europe. Both realize that they can't do that at the moment, but would love to see that as a hopeful opportunity at some point in the future. And the reason they can't is because of the conflict that's going on. The siege, the checkpoints, they obviously can't leave. Most of them, and not just these two, but almost unanimously, the people I've spoken to don't like living under Hamas rule, but generally suggest that as long as they stay away from topics of politics, life's fine under Hamas, as long as they don't engage in any political speech, which I suggest is probably the case in a lot of countries. And potentially, if you're an Arab living in Israel, it would feel that way as well. If what I read on social media and in the press about Israel's Secret Service targeting people that are Israeli Arabs speaking out against the government on social media. And it's, how do you see that? Do you see it?
Well, the truth is Gaza under Hamas does not have Western standards of free speech.
No.
For example, there was a guy who went on a video call with some Israelis, with some other people.
I remember that.
They went to jail. And when they went to jail, I do feel like where were people?
He's been released now. I heard probably a couple of weeks ago that he's been released. Whether he's allowed to go back on Zoom, I don't know. But
But it's really ugly. He has been released, yes. However, he is not allowed to leave Gaza. However, he has been separated from his wife by Hamas because he was married to a party member. And the idea was they wanted to send a message that they didn't want to condone what he was doing. And so he was forcibly separated from his wife. Now she's out of Gaza. He has to stay in Gaza. And he is focused on trying to get her back.
So in your mind, going back to Sheikh Jarrah, the rise of hostilities, you don't believe it was just Sheikh Jarrah. What other events do you think influenced? Obviously, the riots in Jerusalem. What other events do you think were influences in sparking the hostilities?
So I would say the biggest precipitants from a political perspective were the coinciding of the Israeli elections and the canceling of the Palestinian elections. Those two things coming together in a sense were a perfect storm for Netanyahu and Hamas. So Netanyahu, he'd been reaching out to these Arab parties. There was the party Ra'am, who was willing to recognize the state of Israel, who was willing to come into a coalition with his opponents. And so it might have been carelessness. I don't know what it was, but Israel trod a little too heavily on the Temple Mount. They even sent people to cut the wires on the Temple Mount at one point when someone was giving a speech, and they cut the wires from the speaker of Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is an article in the New York Times about this.
Do you think that was a far-right radical, or do you think that was the police, or do you think that was just something that was opportune for somebody that was just protesting at the time, or what's your view?
I believe it was Rivlin who was giving the speech, so it would have been mainstream and government sanctioned to cut the wires, but they know it's not good.
What's your thoughts on because obviously there's a far right faction in Israel that is probably as violent and as militant as any Palestinian faction would be. So and that became obvious, I think, in the news reports we were getting out of Israel in the last few weeks. So you had violent mobs of Arab Palestinians, and you had violent mobs of Jewish Palestinians, sometimes neighbors. What are your thoughts on the fact that the far right, probably more influentially, the far right Jewish community is probably has more of an opportunity to be influential in this conflict than the Palestinian Arab community, in terms of they could be in positions of influence. So they could be policemen or soldiers or even legislators or guards, or more likely to be in those sort of positions than the Arabs. Do you think that impacted at all on the way that the police handled the riots in Jerusalem? Or do you think it impacts at all generally on the police force in Israel?
Well, in the US, the police force is made up of a lot of people with very specific views. And
I'm just people, sorry, and I don't mean to interrupt, but you just said that, and I just thought of how many black policemen there are in American police, in the American police system. and I hear a lot of people talk about Arabs being in, positions of judges, and some Bedouins or Druze might join the army and do a national service. There's Arab politicians of Sheikh Jarrah. What's your view on? Do you think there'll be another outburst when the court decision is made next month, which is only a few days away?
They have a ceasefire.
Yes.
So if I don't know, honestly. If I were going to bet, my guess is no, because the outbreak was basically led by Hamas with others following, and Hamas may need more time to regroup than this.
Yes, I don't know that it's actually going to be driven. If there is, I don't know that it's actually going to, and I don't think this one was specifically driven by either Hamas. It may have been encouraged by Hamas and Likud, but I don't think that any political party has really got the ability to hold. I think this is a grassroots uprising, and it stems from people's frustrations, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, so that these are outlets for expressions of frustration, rightly or wrongly, justified or otherwise. I don't know that any political group in either Israel or in Gaza has got the ability to control that. I can see the blame being thrown back on the Israeli government or Hamas for any violent uprisings, but I don't think it's genuine. I think it's a grassroots movement, and it's that crowd mentality, the wolf pack mentality.
Well, Hamas firing rockets is definitely
grassroots. Absolutely,
that part required more planning.
Yeah. And in fact, I saw a documentary only weeks before this about Hamas in Gaza manufacturing rockets. And what they were doing was they were digging up the old water pipes for the old greeneries that were in Gaza for the Israeli settlers, the greenhouses, and using those pipes as casings for rockets. And another part of this documentary, they showed a warship that had been sunk, and it must have been either the 48 or the 67 war. And the divers managed to find torpedoes in this warship, so they were pulling them out for rockets. And I thought that these are limited supplies of product to make rockets. Once they've exhausted those, there's going to be nothing left, unless you start digging up your own people's real water pipes. And it's interesting that 2 weeks after that documentary, the rockets were fired, and with the veracity that they were fired with, would indicate that they pulled up a lot of water pipes and found a lot of torpedoes and expelled them all at once, just in a show of force, and potentially they may have nothing left or not much left. So they have to rebuild all that. But it's taken, I imagine, from say 2014, when the last Gaza War Operation Protective Edge had finished, till now to accumulate that much rockets.
Well, also, as I understand it, they are supplied by Iran, and there's also weapon smuggling through tunnels from Egypt.
It'd be pretty hard, though, to get those rockets smuggled through those tunnels. I can see I can see guns and I can see, RPG, but I find it, those rockets are pretty big. And it would be pretty obvious to anybody that rockets were being sent down a tunnel. And if they could do that, and Iran was paying for rockets specifically, I think they would have better rockets than what they do. One of the things that always astounds me is I don't think that the Hamas leadership is stupid. And they know that the rockets, for the most part, are going to either be taken down by the Iron Dome or they're going to land in open fields, because they don't have the ability to aim the rockets. So the damage they're going to cause is minimal, yet the repercussions are going to be drastic. So I'm always astounded when Hamas fire rockets and wonder why on earth they're doing it, given that the effect is so minimal, other than to scare the Israelis. But the cost of that, the lives that are lost in Gaza, it just, in my mind, just doesn't seem worth it. Although I think we talked about this earlier, the political advantage for Hamas has been huge. And whether that was planned or whether that was just accidental advantage as a repercussion of firing, I don't know. But for the first time, I think I've ever seen the different groups of Palestinians, whether they're Israeli Palestinians or West Bank Palestinians or Gazans, unite in solidarity. One of the other things that was a little bit troubling was I was reading today RSAC article about 27 Palestinians were killed during that siege in the West Bank. And that the IDF, now this is an RSAC spin on news, obviously, but the IDF took advantage of the conflict to sneak in, to get into the West Bank without garnering too much attention, and shot some people and raided some homes. And this article was about a specific young man that was shot in the West Bank, which is a little bit disturbing. And apparently like 27 is a big number in a very short period of time in the West Bank. I read, can you hear me okay now?
I can hear you okay.
Okay. I was reading an RSAC article where the IDF took advantage of the skirmishes around Gaza to go into the West Bank, and in raids on homes, they ended up killing 27 Palestinians in the West Bank. So part of that death toll, which is never broken down, the 220 odd that were killed on the Palestinian side, part of that is 27 in the West Bank. Not as a result of skirmishes, it was simply raids by the IDF on towns. And this RSAC article was a story about a young man who heard the gunshots, went up on the roof to see what was happening, and the moment he peered out over the edge, he was shot dead. So that was pretty disturbing. But
as one of the 200 odd deaths.
Sorry.
As one of the 200 odd deaths.
Yes. Yeah. And there was 27 instances of that. One of the interesting stats that I read is that that Palestinians are actually amongst the highest educated group of people per capita in the world.
Yeah.
And I think they ranked number 4 or number 5, which is interesting because it goes against all the stereotype images that you have of Palestinians. Yes. Just one more, and I think we should wrap it up. I just want to know where you think this is going in the short term, and potentially, does it have any long-term effects, the recent skirmishes and the ceasefire now?
So in the short term, the skirmishes do seem to have caused people to radicalize. And I
irreversibly
see a military victory for Israel in the sense that Gaza gets blown up and Hamas gets some setbacks, but obviously Hamas is not going to be destroyed. I don't think that Hamas can actually lose militarily. Hamas is the type of group that can feed on despair because it appeals to people who have despair. So the more despair Gaza has, the more they may turn to Hamas. Now, but I do believe that Hamas has, it's ambivalent whether Likud has won. We'll have to see. I'm skeptical that Likud has won. They might have just led to more stalemates in the government and the same cycle of elections. However, I do believe that Hamas has won a political victory. They've gained a lot of support from a lot of unexpected corners. Israel's continuing of the bombing and the timing was relatively difficult for Israel to defend. And Hamas got a lot of people to rally around it. It is quite remarkable if, for example, it's getting Christians who are Palestinian to give it to have a new feeling about it.
Even I dare say Israeli Palestinians.
Yes.
Christian or Muslim, I think that that just having Israeli Palestinians rally around Hamas is a victory in itself. It's the first time, as I said earlier, that I've seen Palestinians show solidarity. And when you consider the lifestyle, the variance in lifestyles that they enjoy, say the Israeli Palestinians would have a much better lifestyle than the West Bank Palestinians, who in turn would have a better lifestyle than the Gazan Palestinians. So they're almost fractured groups, divided already politically, economically. And this skirmish has brought them all together into a solidarity movement.
And it's also not economically, but they're also divided religiously and culturally. It's not, they are quite a diverse group.
Yes.
And so the skirmish really has brought them together, despite these very obvious shortcomings of Hamas.
Yes, yes. And I think we talked about this before. I'm a believer in the fact that I'm jumping on your train, I'm jumping on your bandwagon, not necessarily because I want to reach your destination, but you're generally heading in my direction and I'll get off where I see fit. And there's that feeling I get at the moment about Hamas. The PA has been ineffective and has cost Palestinians more in terms of land and loss of hope and loss of dignity. Hamas, at least, is showing resistance. It's come at a fairly grueling cost with the blockade, but they've managed to have borders drawn. They've managed to expel the settlers. They've managed to some extent have a certain degree of self-determination, and that's been all through violent resistance. Now, there may be a lot of people that don't want a Hamas-style government, and certainly if I was an Israeli Palestinian, I wouldn't swap my life in Israel for a life in Gaza. But it's the only movement that has been effective in creating some sort of change.
Well, this was also something that you were saying even before this episode, that to Palestinians comparing the PA versus Hamas, it looked like Hamas's violent tactics were more effective, even if there were so many other potential causing and confounding factors that, by the way, they may not be aware of, like the greater ancient ties of Israel to the West Bank than to Gaza.
Yes.
But
yes.
But
what's transpired, I guess, over 2 decades is that if you're not going to be given any favors just because you're cooperating with us, and you're more likely. And I think it's a dangerous message. I certainly don't think that's done Israel any favors in that they've grown settlements so dramatically in the West Bank, and these. I think Sheikh Jarrah was just a personification of what the Palestinians feel is being done to them generally. It was an example of what's being done to them generally. They're being dispossessed either individually out of houses or as a collective out of land and estate. And the way the settlements have grown, so that the state becomes almost impossible to create a homogeneous single state, continual single state for the Palestinians. None of these have done Israel much favors in terms of trying to suppress violent uprisings like this. And I dare say that this has only emboldened Hamas and potentially to see more strikes again in the future. Although I have a feeling they've exhausted most of the rockets that they've been building over the last decade.
Well, not clear.
Not clear, no, definitely.
Rockets even after they had offered the ceasefire. So they had not exhausted their rockets when they offered the ceasefire. At some point, they were going to get a ceasefire. And so it lasted like almost 2 weeks, the fighting. And then they got the ceasefire, but they may have been prepared to be fighting for a lot longer. I do not think that they exhausted their rockets. But what else were you saying? The Palestinian solidarity behind Hamas. Yes, I think many Palestinians are not prepared to take this train all the way. Now, there are a lot of possible scenarios here. One that I consider plausible is Hamas cleans house. Hamas has some very dirty laundry. As it becomes the central Palestinian government, which is likely to become, it's going to get more of a spotlight on it, and it may need to do a better job cleaning house, and it may succeed.